Daeho Kim walked through the massive doors of Kepler University for the first time. His heavy footsteps echoed in the crystal hallways, making sounds that seemed too loud in this quiet place. The other students moved around him like water flowing around a rock. Their bodies were so different from his. Some floated in the air like jellyfish. Others crawled on many legs like giant spiders. A few looked like walking trees with branches for arms. The university was the most famous school in the entire galaxy. Students came here from thousands of different worlds to learn about science and math and the mysteries of space. But Daeho was special. He was the first human to ever walk these halls. The first person from Earth to study here. His thick black hair was cut short and neat. His brown eyes looked around at everything with curiosity but also caution. He wore simple clothes from Earth, a blue shirt and black pants that looked plain next to the shining robes and crystal armor that other students wore. His muscles showed through his shirt, making him look strong and solid compared to the thin, delicate aliens around him. The ceiling above him was made of some kind of clear material that showed the stars outside. 3 different suns cast colorful light through the transparent dome. Red light mixed with blue and yellow, creating patterns on the floor that moved like living things. The air smelled clean but strange, like flowers he had never seen before. Daeho checked his schedule on a small device the school had given him. His first class was advanced physics in room 847. He had studied the map of the university for weeks before coming here, but actually walking through it was different. Everything was bigger than he expected. The hallways were wide enough for flying creatures to move through without touching the walls. As he walked, students stopped talking when they saw him. Their eyes followed him with looks of fear and curiosity. Some made clicking sounds with their mouths. Others flashed lights on their skin like signals. He had learned that these were ways different species showed emotion, just like how humans smiled or frowned. A group of students that looked like large blue cats with 6 legs whispered to each other as he passed. One of them spoke in the common galactic language that all species learned. "That is the human," they said. Their voice sounded like wind blowing through metal tubes. The one from the Deathworld. That was what everyone called Earth in the galaxy. It was a planet where everything was dangerous. The gravity was strong enough to crush most aliens. The weather could kill with heat or cold. The plants were poisonous. The animals were violent. Even the air had too much oxygen for most species to breathe safely. But humans had grown up there. They had become strong and tough because of it. Their bones were thick. Their muscles were dense. Their brains had learned to think fast when danger came. Every part of their bodies was built to survive things that would kill other species. Daeho found room 847 and walked inside. The classroom was huge, with seats arranged in circles going up toward the ceiling like a stadium. Each seat was different, designed for the body type of different species. Some seats hung from the ceiling for flying students. Others were filled with water for species that lived in oceans. He looked for a seat that could hold his weight. Most alien furniture was made for beings much lighter than humans. The university had ordered special reinforced seats for him, but he still worried about breaking something by accident. Finally, he found his assigned seat in the back row. It was made of some kind of metal that felt cold under his hands. He sat down carefully, and the seat held his weight without making any noise. Around him, other students settled into their places, the room filled with strange sounds, clicking, humming, buzzing, vibrating. Each species had their own way of talking to each other. Some used sounds that human ears could barely hear. Others flashed lights or changed colors on their skin. A few released smells into the air like chemical messages. Professor Veltar entered the room and all the noise stopped. He was tall, very tall, with 4 arms that moved like the legs of a praying mantis. His head was triangular with huge compound eyes that could look in many directions at once. His skin was green and shiny, like the shell of a beetle. The professor belonged to a species called Zephyrians. They were famous throughout the galaxy for being incredibly smart. They had invented many of the mathematical formulas that other species used to travel between stars. They lived on a world with very light gravity, which made them tall and thin but also very fragile. Professor Veltar moved to the front of the classroom. His 4 arms waved in the air as he began to speak. His voice was high and sharp with clicking sounds mixed in. "Welcome, students, to advanced physics." He said, "Today, we will explore the mysteries of quantum mechanics and gravitational wave theory. These concepts require the highest level of intelligence to understand. I hope you are all prepared for the challenge." His compound eyes swept across the room, stopping when they saw Deho. The professor paused for a moment as if he had forgotten something unpleasant. His mandibles clicked together in what Deho had learned was a sign of displeasure among his species. The professor continued his introduction, but his eyes kept returning to the human student in the back row. Other students noticed this and began to whisper among themselves. Their bioluminescent patches flashed with excitement as they realized drama was building. Deho pulled out his tablet and began taking notes. He had studied these subjects at Seoul National University back on Earth, where he had graduated at the top of his class. The concepts were not new to him, but the way Professor Veltar explained them was different. The professor used mathematics that looked more advanced but were actually saying the same things Earth scientists had discovered. As the lecture continued, Deho noticed that the professor spoke slowly and used very simple examples. It was as if he thought his students were not smart enough to understand complex ideas. The human frowned slightly. This was supposed to be an advanced class, but it felt more like a basic introduction. Around him, other students took notes frantically. Their various appendages moved quickly as they tried to copy down everything the professor said. Some of them made sounds of confusion when mathematical formulas appeared on the holographic display at the front of the room. Professor Veltar noticed the confusion and smiled with his mandibles. "I know this is difficult," he said. "These concepts are at the very edge of civilized understanding. Not all species are capable of grasping such advanced theories." His eyes moved to Deho again, and stayed there longer this time. "Some species," he continued, "are better suited for simpler tasks, physical labor perhaps, or basic maintenance work. The galaxy needs workers of all kinds after all." Several students turned to look at Deho, who kept his face calm, and continued taking notes. He understood the insult but chose not to react. He had been warned that many aliens saw humans as nothing more than strong, dumb animals who had gotten lucky with technology. The lecture ended with Professor Veltar announcing a surprise quiz for the next class period. The quiz would cover gravitational wave theory and quantum mechanical principles. Students around Deho made sounds of panic. Their lights flashed rapidly and some released stress pheromones into the air, but Deho simply closed his tablet and stood up carefully. He had learned these concepts years ago and could solve the problems in his sleep. As he walked toward the exit, he heard Professor Veltar call out Mr. Kim. "Please remember that this is an advanced course designed for the most intelligent species in the galaxy. I would hate to see you struggle with concepts beyond your natural abilities." Deho stopped at the door and turned around. For a moment, his brown eyes met the professor, compound gaze. "Thank you for your concern, Professor," he said politely. "I will do my best." As he left the classroom, he could hear the whispers starting behind him. The other students were already talking about how the human would fail, how he would prove that his species did not belong in civilized academic society. But what they did not know was that Deho Kim had not just studied these subjects, he had helped develop some of the theories himself. His research back on Earth had solved problems that these aliens were still working on. His brain, forged in the harsh environment of a death world, could handle complexity that would overwhelm most species. The real test was about to begin, and Professor Veltar had no idea what he was dealing with. 3 days had passed since the quiz, and Deho Kim walked through the crystal corridors of Kepler University with steady steps. His footsteps echoed louder than usual in the quiet halls, making other students look up from their floating study pods and crystalline tablets. The morning light from the 3 suns cast strange shadows through the transparent ceiling. But today, everything felt different. Groups of alien students stopped their conversations when they saw him. Their bioluminescent patches flickered with excitement, and their various appendages gestured wildly as they whispered in their native languages. He caught fragments of their words in the common galactic tongue. "Perfect score," they said. "Impossible for a Deathworlder. Definitely cheated somehow." The quiz results had been posted that morning, and word had spread faster than light through the university communication networks. Dae-ho had scored 100% on Professor Veltar advanced physics examination. Not 98% or 99%, but a perfect score on problems that were supposed to be nearly impossible for most species to solve. His personal communicator buzzed against his wrist, displaying a message that made his stomach tighten slightly. "Report to Professor Veltar office immediately," it said. The message was marked urgent and came with official university seals that meant this was not a request, but a command. Dae-ho changed direction and headed toward the faculty wing of the university. The hallways here were different from the student areas. The walls were made of some kind of living crystal that pulsed with soft light and seemed to respond to the emotions of people walking by. Right now, the walls glowed, with an angry red color that made the air feel heavy and tense. He found Professor Veltar's office behind a door marked with symbols from 12 different alien languages. The door was twice as tall as a human needed and made of material that looked like frozen starlight. When he pressed the entry chime, the door dissolved into sparkles of light that reformed behind him after he stepped through. The office was incredible and terrifying at the same time. Equations floated in the air like living things made of pure mathematics that twisted and moved in 3 dimensions. Crystalline storage devices hummed with power, containing more information than the entire Internet of Earth. Holographic displays showed the movements of distant galaxies and the birth and death of stars. Professor Veltar stood behind his desk, which was carved from a single piece of what looked like solidified space. His forearms were crossed in front of his chest, and his compound eyes reflected the floating equations. Like mirrors, his mandibles clicked rapidly, which Dae-ho had learned meant the professor was very angry, but the professor was not alone. 2 other figures stood in the shadowy corners of the office. One was Dr. Hae-jin Park, the only other human at the university. She was a visiting researcher in xenobiology and one of the smartest people Dae-ho had ever met. Her presence here could mean she was either going to help him or that the situation was much worse than he thought. The third person was someone Dae-ho had only seen in university broadcast, Professor Quartzmine from the Department of Academic Integrity. Their species looked like living crystals that constantly changed color and shape depending on their thoughts right now. They were a deep purple color, which in their species meant they were analyzing and judging everything around them. "Mr. Kim, Professor," Veltar began, and his voice carried undertones that sounded like metal scraping against stone. "Your performance on my examination has created quite a disturbance in the academic community." Dae-ho stood straight but relaxed with his hands at his sides. He had learned from his military training back on Earth that showing fear or aggression would only make situations worse. "I studied very hard for your quiz, Professor," he said in a calm voice. "I wanted to make sure I understood the material properly." Professor Veltar's mandibles clicked faster, and his bioluminescent patches began flashing in patterns that meant extreme displeasure. "Studied," he repeated with something like a laugh. "Your species discovered faster than light travel only 50 years ago. Your planet is classified as a death world where most of your energy goes to simply surviving. How could you possibly understand mathematics that took my species 3,000 years to develop?" Dr. Park shifted uncomfortably in her specially reinforced chair. She was clearly torn between defending her fellow human and keeping her position at the university. Her research was too important to risk, but watching another human being accused of cheating was obviously painful for her. "The equations we used in that quiz," Professor Veltar continued, "are based on theoretical frameworks that require computational abilities far beyond what Deathworlder brains can achieve. Your people are strong, yes, and adaptable, certainly, but intelligence at this level requires evolutionary development that takes millions of years." Dae-ho felt heat rising in his chest, but he kept his breathing steady and his voice calm. "Professor, with respect, my planet may be dangerous, but that danger made us very good at solving complex problems quickly. When everything around you is trying to kill you, your brain learns to process multiple variables simultaneously and find solutions under extreme pressure." Quartzmine shifted colors to a bright orange, which meant they were recording everything for official analysis. They had not spoken yet, but their presence meant this meeting would become part of Dae-ho permanent academic record. "Impossible," Professor Veltar said, and his forearms began waving in agitation. I have reviewed your educational background. Mr. Kim, your Earth universities lack the advanced quantum processors that we use for these calculations. Your libraries contain no references to the mathematical principles required for this level of physics. You could not have learned these concepts through legitimate study. Dr. Park finally spoke up, and her voice was carefully controlled. Professor Veltar, I have worked with human researchers for several years now. Their approach to problem solving is different from ours, but no less valid. They often develop solutions independently that match or exceed our own theoretical work. The professor compound eyes turned toward Dr. Park like weapon systems targeting an enemy. Dr. Park, he said coldly, I respect your expertise in xenobiology, but theoretical physics is my domain. I know what is possible and what is not. A Deathworlder solving these equations in the time limit given is simply not possible without external assistance. Dae-ho realized that the professor had already made up his mind about what had happened. The quiz results did not fit his understanding of human capabilities, so the only explanation in his mind was cheating. He decided to try a different approach. Professor, what if I could demonstrate my knowledge in a way that would remove all doubt about external assistance? What if I solved similar problems in front of witnesses without any technology or communication devices? Professor Veltar compound eyes focused on Dae-ho with sudden interest, and his mandibles stopped clicking for a moment. The office became very quiet, except for the humming of the crystal storage devices and the soft whisper of equations moving through the air. You would submit to a public examination? He asked. His voice carried a tone that humans would recognize as dangerous satisfaction. A live demonstration in front of faculty and students where every aspect of your performance could be monitored and recorded. Yes, Dae-ho said without hesitation. If that is what it takes to prove that humans can understand advanced physics, then I accept your challenge, Professor. Court's mind suddenly changed to a bright silver color, which meant they were very interested in what was happening. They spoke for the first time, and their voice sounded like crystal bells ringing. This is highly irregular, but the academic integrity of our institution requires that all accusations be thoroughly investigated. Dr. Park looked worried, but she nodded slowly. If Mr. Kim is willing to undergo such an examination, then the university should provide him with that opportunity. However, I insist that the examination be conducted fairly with problems equivalent to but not identical to those on the original quiz. Professor Veltar forearms spread wide, and his bioluminescent patches began flashing with what looked like triumph. Bradier. Well, Deathworlder, tomorrow morning in Lecture Hall Prime, you will face an examination that will determine once and for all whether your species possesses the intellectual capacity for advanced galactic education. He leaned forward across his desk, and his compound eyes seemed to glow with malicious pleasure. When you fail, as you inevitably will, it will prove that humans are nothing more than clever animals who have somehow stumbled upon technology beyond their comprehension. Your entire species will be removed from our academic programs and returned to whatever primitive pursuits are suitable for death. Worlders. Dae-ho met the professor gaze steadily. I understand the stakes, Professor, and I accept them. But I think you might be surprised by what Deathworlders are capable of when we put our minds to it. As he left the office behind him, he could hear Professor Veltar already making communication calls to arrange the public examination. Word would spread throughout the university. Within hours and by tomorrow morning, every student and faculty member would know about the challenge. What Professor Veltar did not understand was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his academic career. He was about to learn that humans did not just survive on Deathworlds, they thrived on them, and they never backed down from a challenge, especially when the honor of their entire species was at stake. The morning sun cast long shadows through the crystal dome of Lecture Hall Prime as students from every corner of the galaxy packed into seats that had never seen such a crowd. The hall was designed to hold 500 beings, but nearly 800 had somehow squeezed inside. Students hung from the ceiling, floated in specialized chambers, and pressed against the walls in a mass of different body types and colors. Word of the challenge had spread through the university communication networks faster than anyone expected. Social media feeds buzzed with speculation and betting pools. Student forums crashed from too much traffic, as everyone wanted to know what would happen when the Deathworlder faced his public examination day. Kim sat in his usual seat in the back row, but today it felt different. Every eye in the massive hall was focused on him. Some species showed curiosity through flashing lights on their skin. Others released chemical signals that filled the air with the scent of excitement. A few made clicking sounds that meant they were nervous or afraid. He wore the same simple clothes he always did, blue shirt, black pants, and comfortable shoes from Earth. But today, these ordinary items felt like armor. He had slept well the night before, and eaten a breakfast of foods from home that Dr. Park had somehow managed to find in the university cafeteria. His mind was clear and focused, ready for whatever Professor Veltar had prepared. The professor entered the hall with dramatic flair that would have impressed actors on Earth. His forearms carried multiple data tablets, projection devices, and what looked like advanced monitoring equipment. Behind him walked Dean Silvera, whose species appeared as beings of pure energy contained in crystalline shells. The dean presence meant this examination had the official approval of the university administration. Dean Silvera floated to the center of the hall and spoke in a voice that resonated through every communication device in the room. Today we gather to witness an unprecedented event in galactic academic history, a public examination to determine the intellectual capabilities of the human species and their place in advanced education. The dean gestured toward Deho with one of their energy appendages. Mr. Kim has requested the opportunity to demonstrate his knowledge publicly, and Professor Veltar has agreed to conduct this examination. The results will be recorded and transmitted to academic institutions throughout the galaxy. Professor Veltar moved to his position at the front of the hall. His compound eyes swept across the packed audience before settling on Deho. His mandibles clicked in what might have been satisfaction or anticipation. Today, he announced, we will determine whether humans possess genuine intelligence or whether they are merely clever mimics who have somehow gained access to technology beyond their natural abilities. The first questions were basic, ones that any advanced student should know. What is the relationship between matter and energy? How do gravitational fields affect the passage of time? What are the fundamental forces that hold atoms together? Ho answered each question clearly and completely. His voice carried to every corner of the hall through the amplification system, and his explanations were so thorough that students began taking notes. Even species that considered themselves highly intelligent found his descriptions helpful and easy to understand. Professor Veltar's expression grew more serious as the questions continued. He moved from basic concepts to intermediate theories, then to advanced mathematics that would challenge graduate students from the most developed worlds. Each time Deho provided answers that were not only correct, but showed deep understanding of the underlying principles. The atmosphere in the hall began to change. Students who had come expecting to see a human fail started whispering to each other in amazement. Some species that had never paid attention to Earth or its people began recording the examination for later study. The betting pools that had favored the professor were suddenly shifting as more credits were placed on the human. Professor Veltar forearms moved faster as he consulted his tablets and projection devices. His questions became more desperate, as if he were searching for something that the human could not answer. He asked about quantum mechanics that his own species had developed, about gravitational wave theory that required supercomputers to calculate, about mathematical relationships that existed only in theoretical models. But Deho continued to answer every question, not just with the correct formulas, but with explanations of how those formulas could be applied to real-world problems. He discussed how Earth scientists had independently developed many of the same theories using different mathematical approaches. He showed that human mathematics, while different from galactic standards, was equally valid and often more elegant. As the examination continued, something unexpected began to happen. Students in the audience started asking their own questions, not to challenge Deho, but because they genuinely wanted to understand the concepts he was explaining. His teaching style was different from their professor's, more direct and practical, and it helped them grasp ideas they had struggled with before. Professor Veltar realized that his plan was backfiring. Instead of proving human intellectual inferiority, The examination was demonstrating that Earth had produced scientists and mathematicians who could match or exceed the best minds in the galaxy. His bioluminescent patches began flashing in patterns that indicated extreme stress, and his mandibles clicked so rapidly they created a continuous buzzing sound. The final question was one that Professor Veltar had been saving as his ultimate weapon. It was a mathematical proof that his species claimed had taken them 3 centuries to solve and required computational power that only the most advanced civilizations possessed. If the human could solve this, then either he was receiving impossible technological assistance, or Professor Veltar's fundamental assumptions about intelligence were completely wrong. The equation appeared on the holographic display at the front of the hall, a massive construct of symbols and relationships that seemed to twist and move in dimensions that hurt to look at directly. Most of the students in the audience could not even understand what the equation was asking, much less how to solve it. Deho studied the display for several minutes while the hall waited in complete silence. He could hear his own heartbeat and feel the weight of 800 pairs of eyes watching his every movement. Then he stood up and walked to the front of the hall where a writing surface had been prepared for him. What happened next would be talked about. In academic circles for generations, Deho began to work through the proof step-by-step writing with clear, precise strokes that everyone could follow. He did not just solve the equation, he improved it, showing a more elegant approach that reduced the number of steps by half and revealed underlying patterns that had been hidden in the original formulation. The silence in the hall was broken by gasps and exclamations from students and faculty alike. Even Dean Silvera's energy field flickered. With what appeared to be amazement, Professor Veltar stood frozen, his forearms hanging limply at his sides as he watched a human not just solve his most difficult problem, but make it look easy. When Deho finished writing, he turned to face the audience. The proof was complete and correct, but more than that, it was beautiful in the way that mathematical truth could be beautiful. It showed relationships and patterns that opened new possibilities for understanding the universe. "Thank you," he said simply. "I hope this demonstration has been helpful." The hall erupted in chaos as students from dozens of species began shouting questions, comments, and expressions of amazement in their native languages. Professor Veltar, compound eyes remained fixed on the holographic display where Deho's elegant proof continued to shine like a beacon of intellectual achievement. For the first time in his long academic career, the professor was completely speechless. The chaos in Lecture Hall Prime continued for several minutes as students tried to process what they had just witnessed. Some species communicated through rapid light patterns that turned the hall into a disco of flashing colors. Others released pheromones that created a complex mixture of scents in the air. A few began what sounded like singing, but was actually their way of expressing extreme excitement. Dean Silvera attempted to restore order by amplifying their voice through the hall communication system, but even their authority could not immediately calm the crowd. Students were too amazed by what the human had accomplished, too shocked that their assumptions about Deathworlders had been completely wrong. Professor Veltar remained frozen at the front of the hall. His compound eyes stared at the holographic display where Deho's mathematical proof continued to glow with perfect clarity. His forearms trembled slightly and his bioluminescent patches flickered in random patterns that indicated his mind was struggling to accept what had happened. Slowly, very slowly, the professor began to move. His head turned toward Deho, who had returned to his seat and was sitting quietly while the chaos continued around him. The human appeared completely calm, as if solving impossible mathematical proofs in front of hundreds of witnesses was something he did every day. Something began to change in Professor Veltar's posture. His trembling stopped, and his patches began flashing in a new pattern, one that students who knew his species would recognize as dangerous. His mandibles started clicking, not with the rapid, nervous clicking of stress, but with the slow, deliberate clicking of building rage. "This is impossible," he said, but his voice was too quiet to be heard over the crowd noise. He repeated it louder. "This is impossible." The mathematical proof that glowed above them seemed to mock his words with its obvious correctness. Dean Silvera finally managed to quiet the crowd enough to speak. The examination appears to be concluded. They announced Mr. Kim has demonstrated remarkable proficiency in advanced theoretical physics and has provided innovative solutions to complex mathematical problems. But Professor Veltar was no longer listening to the dean or to anyone else. His mind had snapped under the pressure of having his fundamental beliefs about intelligence and species hierarchy completely destroyed. In his worldview, humans were supposed to be strong, but stupid, violent, but not clever. They were Deathworlders who had gotten lucky with technology, not genuine intellectuals who could contribute to galactic knowledge. "No," he said, and his voice carried clearly through the now quiet hall. "No, this cannot be real." The professor began to pace back and forth, his forearms gesturing wildly as he spoke. His movements became more erratic and his voice grew louder with each word. "This is some kind of trick," he declared. "Some kind of deception or illusion." Students in the audience began to look uncomfortable as they realized their professor was having what humans would call a mental breakdown. His species was known for their emotional stability and logical thinking, but the cognitive dissonance of the situation had overwhelmed his ability to process reality. "You cannot be this intelligent," he said, pointing one of his arms at Daeho. "Your species barely discovered fire when mine was exploring the galaxy. You live on a world so savage that even your plants are poisonous. You are evolutionary mistakes who got lucky." The insults continued to pour from the professor as his voice grew more shrill and desperate. He abandoned all pretense of academic language and began hurling personal attacks at Daeho and at humanity in general. The other faculty members in the hall looked shocked, but none of them dared to interrupt a tenured professor during his tirade. "Your entire species is a cosmic joke," Professor Veltar screamed. His compound eyes had taken on a wild gleam and spittle flew from his mandibles. "You come from a world where everything tries to kill you, because even your own planet knows you do not belong in the universe." Daeho remained seated with his hands folded calmly in his lap, but those who knew humans well might have noticed subtle changes in his posture. His breathing had become more controlled and deliberate. His jaw muscles had tightened slightly, and his brown eyes had taken on a harder quality. Dr. Park, who was sitting in the faculty section, recognized the warning signs she had seen humans under stress before, and knew that her species had limits to how much abuse they would tolerate. She began to look worried and started to stand up as if preparing to intervene. "You, Deathworlders, are nothing but violent primitive beasts." Professor Veltar continued, his voice reaching a shrieking pitch that hurt the ears of several species in the audience. "You will contaminate our peaceful galaxy with your barbaric ways. You have no business in civilized society." The professor's forearms waved frantically as he paced back and forth like a caged animal. His movements had become so erratic that students in the front rows began to move back for their own safety. Some of the more fragile species started to leave the hall entirely unable to handle the intense emotions being displayed. Dean Silvera began floating toward the professor, clearly intending to intervene before the situation got worse, but Professor Veltar was beyond reason. Now his pride had been shattered by a being he considered inferior, and his rational mind had been completely overwhelmed by emotion. "I will not allow some knuckle-dragging caveman to make a mockery of everything my species has achieved," he shrieked. The words echoed through the hall and were automatically translated into dozens of languages, so that every species present could understand the insult. Several students gasped at the crude language Professor Veltar had crossed, a line from academic criticism into pure xenophobic hatred. While many species harbored prejudices against humans, few would express them so openly and violently in a public forum. "You belong in a zoo, not a university." The professor continued, his voice breaking with rage. "You are specimens to be studied, not equals to be respected. Your primitive brains cannot possibly comprehend the complexities of advanced civilization." That was when something changed in Daeho Kim. The change was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone who understood human body language. His breathing became slower and more controlled. His muscles appeared to coil like springs under tension. His hands remained folded, but his knuckles had turned white. Dr. Park recognized the signs immediately and began moving toward the front of the hall. She knew that humans had limits and that Professor Veltar was pushing dangerously close to those limits. The professor species might be known for their intelligence, but they were also known for their physical fragility. Professor Veltar, blinded by his own rage and humiliation, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He stormed down from his elevated platform and began walking directly toward Deho. Seat. His forearms gestured wildly as he continued his tirade. "Look at this pathetic creature," he screamed, pointing at Deho. "This is what passes for intelligence on your savage world. This is the best your species can produce." The professor got closer and closer to the human student, his voice growing louder and more abusive with each step. Students throughout the hall held their breath, sensing that something terrible was about to happen, but unable to look away from the approaching confrontation. Professor Veltar stopped directly in front of Deho's seat, close enough that the human could smell the alien fear, pheromones mixed with rage. Close enough that the professor could jab one of his forearms toward the human face while continuing his stream of insults. The entire hall fell silent, waiting to see what would happen next. The professor's arm waved inches from Deho's face as he screamed his final insult. "This is what your species calls intelligence. This worthless specimen of primitive evolution," for a moment that seemed to last forever. The human and the alien stared at each other. The professor's arm continued to wave dangerously close to Deho's face while 800 beings watched in tense silence. Then very quietly, Deho Kim spoke his first word since completing the mathematical proof. "Professor," he said in a voice so calm, it was almost whisper, "I think you should step back now." Professor Veltar did not step back. Instead, he leaned closer to Deho, his compound eyes blazing with hatred, and his mandibles clicking so rapidly they sounded like an angry insect. His forearms continued to wave frantically, and one of them came within inches of the human face. "Do not tell me what to do. You primitive animal," he screamed loud enough that his voice cracked. "I am a professor at the most prestigious university in the galaxy. I have spent my entire life advancing the cause of knowledge and intelligence while your species was still throwing rocks at each other." The professor's arm waved closer and closer to Deho's face as he continued his rant. "You have no right to sit in my classroom, no right to pretend you understand concepts that are beyond your mental capacity. You are an insult to every intelligent being in the galaxy." Students throughout the hall watched in horrified fascination as their professor completely lost control of himself. Several faculty members began moving toward the front, but they were too far away to intervene quickly. Dr. Park was closer, but even she could not reach them in time to prevent what was about to happen. "Your species should have been left on your death world to kill each other." Professor Veltar shrieked, his voice reaching a pitch that caused pain to several species in the audience. "You are a plague that will destroy civilized society with your violence and stupidity." What happened next occurred so quickly that most beings in the hall did not even see it clearly. Deho did not stand up, did not raise his voice, did not change his relaxed sitting position in any dramatic way. He simply reached out with his right hand and grasped Professor Veltar's extended arm at the wrist. The movement was so smooth and natural that it looked almost casual, like someone reaching for a glass of water. The human hand wrapped around the alien wrist with what appeared to be a gentle grip. But Professor Veltar's reaction was immediate and dramatic. The professor continued his screaming rant for exactly 3 more seconds before the reality of his situation penetrated his rage-addled mind. His compound eyes focused on the human hand wrapped around his delicate limb, and for the first time in the entire confrontation, he fell completely silent. The sudden quiet was so complete that everyone in the hall could hear their own breathing. The only sound was the soft humming of the university environmental systems and the faint crackling of energy from Dean Silvera. "Crystalline shell," Professor Deho said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the silent auditorium. "I have sat here patiently while you questioned my intelligence, insulted my species, and attacked my right to exist as a thinking being. I have remained calm and respectful because I believe in academic discourse and the exchange of ideas between civilized people." Professor Veltar tried to pull his arm free but discovered that the human grip was immovable. The human hand felt like it was made of steel wrapped in flesh, completely unmoving, despite the professor's desperate attempts to escape. However, Dae-ho continued in the same conversational tone. "You have now made this personal. You have crossed the line from academic criticism to personal attack. You have questioned not just my abilities but my fundamental right to be treated as an intelligent being." There was a soft sound, barely audible even in the completely silent hall. A tiny crack, like a twig breaking underfoot. Professor Veltar's compound eyes went wide with shock and then narrowed with pain as he realized what had just happened. His arm now bent at an angle that was clearly not natural for his species. The bone had snapped, cleanly. But the human hand still held him gently, preventing him from falling or pulling away. The professor's mouth opened in a silent scream of agony as the reality of his situation became clear. "I want you to understand something," Dae-ho said, still, speaking in that same calm, quiet voice. "Humans do not just survive on Deathworlds, Professor. We thrive on them. We adapt to any challenge, we overcome any obstacle, and we protect what we value most." Professor Veltar finally found his voice and released a high-pitched shriek that sounded like metal being torn apart. Several students in the front rows covered their ears while others began making distress calls on their communication devices. Dae-ho released his grip and calmly placed his hand back. In his lap, Professor Veltar collapsed to his knees, cradling his broken arm against his chest while making sounds that roughly translated to sobbing. His compound eyes leaked a clear fluid that was probably tears, though it was hard to tell with his species. "Today I was protecting the honor of my species and the principle that intelligence comes in many forms," Dae-ho said, as he finally stood up from his seat. His movement was careful and controlled, as if he were afraid of breaking something else by accident. Medical personnel began rushing into the hall carrying equipment designed for various alien physiologies. Dr. Park reached the scene first and began scanning Professor Veltar with a medical device while speaking rapidly into her communication device. Dean Silvera floated closer, their energy field flickering with what might have been shock or amazement. "Mr. Kim," they said, after a long pause, "your academic standing is no longer in question. Professor Veltar will be receiving immediate medical attention and will likely be taking an extended leave of absence to reconsider his teaching methods." The other faculty members gathered around their injured colleague, some looking horrified, others appearing thoughtful. Students throughout the hall sat in stunned silence, finally understanding what the term Deathworlder truly meant. They had heard stories about human strength, but seeing it demonstrated so casually was something entirely different. Dae-ho gathered his materials and began walking toward the exit. His footsteps echoed in the quiet hall as hundreds of beings watched him move with that same careful control he had shown throughout the entire confrontation. At the doorway, he paused and turned back to address the stunned audience. "For those who are wondering," he said in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall, "humans do not just survive on Deathworlds. We thrive on them, we adapt, we overcome, and we protect what matters to us." He looked directly at the injured professor who was being loaded onto a medical transport device. "Professor Veltar, your equations were actually quite elegant. It is unfortunate that your prejudice prevented you from appreciating that a human could not only understand them but improve upon them." With that, Dae-ho Kim walked out of Lecture Hall Prime, leaving behind 800 beings who would never again question whether humans belonged in galactic academia. The sound of his footsteps faded into the distance, but the impact of what they had witnessed would last forever. Within hours, the story began spreading throughout the galaxy, carried by student social networks, faculty gossip channels, and official university communications. The tale grew with each telling, but the core remained the same. A human student had broken a professor's arm without even standing up, proving once and for all that Earth children were not to be underestimated. News feeds across civilized space picked up the story. Universities on distant worlds began reviewing their admission policies for humans. Governments that had dismissed Earth as a minor player in galactic affairs suddenly found themselves reconsidering their diplomatic positions. But perhaps the most significant change occurred in the classrooms and lecture halls throughout the galaxy. Never again would an alien professor question whether a human student belonged in their classroom. Some lessons as the galaxy learned that day are best taught by example professor. Veltar eventually recovered from his injuries but never returned to teaching. His research notes were quietly archived, and his theories on species intelligence were removed from university curricula. The official record stated that he had taken early retirement for health reasons, but everyone knew the real story. Dae-ho Kim completed his studies at Kepler University with highest honors. His thesis on alternative approaches to quantum mechanics became required reading at institutions across the galaxy. When he graduated, he was offered positions at universities on dozens of worlds, but he chose to return to Earth, where he established a new institute for human-alien scientific cooperation. The incident became legend among humans and aliens alike. A reminder that intelligence comes in many forms, that strength is not always physical, and that respect must be earned, not demanded. The story of the Deathworlder who never stood up became a tale told to young beings throughout the galaxy about the importance of treating all species with dignity regardless of where they came from. And in quiet moments when the three sons of Kepler University sat behind the crystal dome of Lecture Hall Prime, some say you can still hear the echo of that single soft crack that changed everything.